In July of 1987, a hunter came out of the Everglades shaking like he'd seen a ghost. Said he found something metal half sunk in the mud, something with wings. For 9 years, nobody in Cypress Bend had spoken the Ramsey name out loud. Not really. Not unless it was behind closed doors. But once that wreck was found, every locked box in this town cracked open. And every memory we tried to bury came rising right back up. Before we start, hit subscribe to help uncover stories they tried to bury, and make sure no name stays forgotten. My name's Jenny Harmon. I was born and raised in Cypress Bend, Florida. Back then, it was the kind of place where you knew your neighbors, where the kids ran barefoot until the porch lights came on. I lived 3 blocks from April Ramsey. We met in 5th grade, band, she played clarinet, I played flute. By middle school, we were inseparable. Every weekend, we'd ride our bikes up to the bait shop for cold sodas and spend hours cataloging our dreams in her room windows, open cicadas humming. The Ramseys were the kind of family people looked up to. John, her dad, owned the hardware store on Main. Always had a grease rag in his back pocket, always remembered your name. Linda, her mom, ran the school fundraisers and never missed a bake sale. She'd press a $5 bill into your palm and whisper, "Don't tell your folks." Bobby, April's little brother, was 10 and already obsessed with baseball. They were steady people. Church on Sundays, pot roast on the stove, car always washed. If there were cracks in that picture, I never saw them. Or maybe I just didn't want to. The week before they disappeared, everything looked normal on the outside. They were heading out for a short trip, one of those little charter flights over the wetlands. Something tourists do all the time. I remember April calling me the night before, her voice quiet. Not scared exactly, just distracted. She said she couldn't hang out that weekend, that they'd be back Monday. I told her I'd save her a seat at lunch. She said, "Yeah, see you then." I still hear the way she said it, like she was trying to believe it. The morning of July 17th, 1978, my mom saw them at the airstrip just after sunrise. 1 green duffel bag, 1 red picnic cooler. The pilot, Pete Carson, was a local former Air Force, flew those swamp tours for years. Folks trusted him. By noon, the plane never landed in Everglades City. Radar lost them just west of town. At first, people said maybe they got turned around, maybe had to make an emergency landing. But by that evening, the search was already underway. Helicopters, volunteers, boats crawling through the reeds. They never found a thing. No debris, no luggage, not even a scrap of fabric. April's bedroom window stayed shut after that. Her textbooks stacked just like she left them. Her clarinet sat on the chair by the bed for months before someone finally packed it away. For years I told myself she just disappeared into the sky, that she never saw it coming, that it was quick. But then came the summer of 1987. The call came late, just before dark. Sheriff Swopey asked me to come down to the station, said it was about the Ramseys. I didn't say anything at first, just stared at the phone in my hand, because I already knew. Something was wrong, and it had been wrong for a long, long time. At first, I didn't say a word, just stood there at the edge of the station parking lot watching the flashing lights bounce off the trees. The swamp hadn't changed much in 9 years. Still thick, still humming with heat and things that moved just out of sight. But that morning, everything felt different. Sheriff Swopey was already out there, sleeves rolled, standing ankle-deep in muck as her team secured the wreckage. I followed behind this deputy who'd called me, stepping over vines and puddles that had swallowed more than just footprints over the years. And then, I saw it. The tail of a Cessna, its paint long since bleached by sun and time half buried under roots and brush. The numbers were barely readable, but I didn't need confirmation. I knew what it was. The red picnic cooler was still strapped in, and beside it, a green duffel bag just like the one I'd seen April carry that morning they left. No one spoke for a long while. It was like the swamp had swallowed the noise, too. When the forensics team opened the duffel, the first thing that slipped out was a torn page from April's diary. The date matched the day they vanished. Her handwriting was unmistakable, tight loops slanted right. The words on the page stopped mid-sentence. "He's not who he says he is. If something happens to us..." The rest was just a rip. That one line knocked the breath out of me. April never liked confrontation. She wrote everything down because it was safer than saying it out loud, but that whatever she was trying to say, she meant for someone to find. Back at the evidence tent, they pulled the rest of the contents from the duffel. A damp change of clothes, sunscreen. A second diary page dated 2 days before the flight. That one was even more unsettling. Dad seemed nervous this morning. Mom kept glancing at Mr. Carson like she wanted to say something but couldn't. Something's off. I stood to the side while they cataloged everything, trying to keep my hands from shaking. That wasn't the April I knew, unsure watching her parents with fear. Something had shifted in that house in the days before they left, something none of us saw. Deputy Gertz came jogging up not long after, breathless and mud-streaked, holding a cracked Polaroid. He said he found it caught in the roots near the wreckage. When they wiped it clean, we all leaned in. It was the Ramsey family standing beside the plane. Linda and Bobby were smiling. April looked unsure, but it was John that stuck out. His smile was forced, his eyes downcast. And Pete Carson, he was standing just behind April, one hand resting on her shoulder. I hadn't seen his face in nearly a decade, but there was something in the way he looked at the camera that made the hair on my arms stand up. Sheriff Swope gathered everyone back at the station late that night. She laid the diary page and the Polaroid out on the table, her voice steady but low. "This wasn't a crash caused by a storm," she said. Something happened before they ever left the ground. Deputy Gertz added that the cockpit log showed no distress call, no radio chatter, no attempt to contact anyone at all. It was like they vanished in silence. The town found out before the morning papers did. Word travels fast in places like Cypress Bend. At the diner, the old stories came rushing back, rumors about John owing money, whispers about Linda, and a councilman talk about Pete's drinking. I hadn't heard some of those names in years. It was like the wreckage had dragged every buried suspicion back to the surface. Later that afternoon, Swope visited Linda's parents, who had driven in from Pensacola. Her father, Walter, looked years older than I remembered. He told the sheriff that Linda had called him the morning of the flight, said she wished they hadn't agreed to it. She'd sounded scared. Then he handed over a bundle of old letters she'd sent him the week before they vanished. One line near the end stood out. "We're all on edge. John's acting strange." April keeps watching him. Bobby is too young to notice. Meanwhile, the forensic team opened the red cooler. Inside, beneath spoiled remnants of food, they found a folded napkin. There was a smudged phone number written on it, and a note in Linda's handwriting. "If we don't come back, call this man. He'll know what to do." The number was for a payphone in Miami. It had been disconnected for years, but that didn't stop the questions. Who was the man, and why did she think he could help? By then, every square inch of the wreck site had been photographed, logged, and sealed. But the most pressing question hung in the air. Where were the bodies? The plane had been torn apart, yes, but not in a way that suggested violent impact. There were no bones, no human remains, just silence. Sheriff Swope spent that night in her office piecing together every thread. She contacted Miami Metro, asking if they could trace any calls tied to that number. The detective she spoke with said the payphone had come up before in a case involving fraudulent life insurance claims and small-town pilots who disappeared after collecting payouts. "We never found the ringleader," he said, but that phone line showed up in the paperwork more than once. Deputy Gertz was sent to Pete Carson's old house. It had been empty for years. He dug through old utility bills, flight logs, and finally, in a back corner of the filing cabinet, found a folder labeled Cypress. Inside were 2 life insurance policies, one for Pete, one for John Ramsey, both updated just weeks before the family vanished. Forensics came back from the swamp with one more discovery. Under the pilot's seat, buried in the mud, they found a rusted wristwatch. The engraving on the back read, "To John, all my love." It was Linda's handwriting. The clasp was crusted with dried blood. None of it added up, not yet. But the weight of it was growing. That night, I sat on the floor of my old bedroom holding a stack of clippings I'd kept since I was 14. Every article, every rumor, every picture. I hadn't looked at them in years. But now it felt like April had been leaving us a trail all along, like she'd never really given up hope that someone would follow it. The next morning I walked back to the station with something I hadn't told anyone. A secret April once told me when we were kids. Just a single sentence whispered in my ear the day before she left. I'd never understood it, not until now. She said if something happens, don't believe it was an accident. And she meant it. I told the sheriff what April had whispered to me all those years ago. She didn't say much, just that if something happened, not to believe it was an accident. I hadn't understood it at the time. But now, with that diary page in hand and the wreckage still half sunken in the Everglades, it was starting to feel like April had left us something more than just a warning. Sheriff Swopey had the station locked down tight after that. She pulled the entire Ramsey file from the archives pages, yellowed corners, folded half the evidence logs, missing dates. Some of the interview transcripts had been removed altogether. She called in a deputy and asked him to find out who'd handled the initial paperwork. His face said what none of us wanted to admit out loud. It had been Sheriff Lester Mlan, her predecessor. The man who led the original search, who stood up at the vigil and told the town he'd exhausted every lead. He retired just a year after the Ramseys vanished. I remember shaking his hand once at a pancake breakfast. Quiet man. Kept his hat on indoors. I would have trusted him with anything. Back then, I was just a teenager. No one took me seriously when I asked questions. Even when I showed them the old notes April had passed me at school, the ones where she mentioned her dad arguing with a stranger behind the hardware store, or how Pete Carson had started showing up at their house unannounced, grown-ups just smiled and said I was grieving. People assumed the Ramseys had hit bad weather, maybe crashed into deep water. But I remember how the teachers changed the subject if April's name came up, how folks at church whispered about her mom, how no one really looked too closely after the second week. At the station, Deputy Gertz was going through the contents of the wreck again. He paused over the napkin they'd found in the red cooler, the one with the phone number and Linda's handwriting. Swopey had already contacted Miami Metro to check it out, but so far nothing useful had come back. The number had been disconnected for decades. No subscriber record. Just a note in an old report about a cluster of insurance fraud cases linked to charter flights and payouts that never reached their intended beneficiaries. When she pushed the detective on the other end of the line, he admitted the number had popped up in at least 3 separate cases, each one involving small planes, sudden disappearances, and pilots who vanished just before they were meant to testify. "We never found the ringleader," he said, "but the ones who went missing all had something to lose." That afternoon, Gertz drove out to Pete Carson's old house. It hadn't been touched in years. The shutters were rotting the grass shoulder high. Inside, he found boxes of flight manifests, utility receipts, stacks of old maps with hand-drawn notations. In a rusted filing cabinet tucked behind a stack of unpaid invoices, he pulled out a thin folder labeled Cypress. Inside were 2 life insurance policies, one for Pete, one for John Ramsey. Both updated within 30 days of the family's disappearance, both naming the other as secondary beneficiary. Back at the station, the forensic team had something new. Down in the mud beneath the pilot's seat, they'd unearthed a wristwatch. It was caked in grime, but the inscription on the back was still legible. To John. All my love. I remembered that watch. Linda gave it to him for their anniversary. He wore it every day until the week they vanished. There was dried blood caught in the clasp. The phone calls started coming in faster after that. Old neighbors, former classmates, people who'd kept quiet in '78 but couldn't anymore. One woman said she'd seen Pete Carson in Miami the day before the crash, arguing with a woman in dark sunglasses and a heavy accent. A former employee at the hardware store came forward with a memory of John taking a call out back, looking panicked. He said John had locked the register that afternoon and refused to explain why, just told him to take the rest of the day off. Another tip placed Pete at a roadside bar near the state line buying drinks for a man no one recognized, described as Cuban-American, late 30s, wearing a blue windbreaker. Swopey paid a visit to the Ramseys' old neighbor, Mrs. Donovan. She still lived in the same bungalow windows, shuttered porch, sagging. She invited the sheriff in without asking why she'd come. Said she'd been waiting for this visit since the summer of '78. Her hands trembled as she handed over an envelope. Linda gave me this just before they left, she said. Told me if anything happened I should take it to the police. But I got scared. I'm sorry. Inside was a single note in Linda's handwriting. We're not safe. Watch the man in the blue jacket. The following morning, Miami Metro called back. One of their detectives, Felix Ramos, said he had a name that might be worth looking into. Victor Diaz, connected to multiple cases involving fraudulent charters, hush money, forged policy paperwork. Never convicted, but his name came up in nearly every investigation tied to the Miami payphone number. Ramos added one more thing. We lost track of him in July '78, he said, just days after the Ramseys disappeared. Later that day, Gertz returned with more from Pete Carson's house. Hidden behind a false panel in the office wall, he found a set of financial ledgers. Most were standard business expenses, but one stood out. A receipt for a $5,000 withdrawal dated 2 days before the flight. The initials on the carbon copy, VD. That evening, Swopey invited me back to the station. She spread the photos, the diary pages, the napkin, the insurance policies, all of it across the table. I stood there for a long time, not saying anything. She finally asked if there was anything April ever said that might make sense now, anything about her father or Pete or someone she didn't trust. I told her about the day April showed up at my house with a bruise on her arm, said someone had lost their temper. I'd assumed she meant her dad, but now I wasn't so sure. Just before midnight, Deputy Gertz walked in holding a sealed plastic evidence bag. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. During a second sweep of the wreckage, he'd crawled beneath the co-pilot's seat and found a hidden compartment. Inside was a pilot's license in the name of Peter Collins. The photo matched Pete Carson. Alongside it, a laminated ID linked to Diaz, same face, same alias. Wrapped in plastic, there was also a stack of old photos. Pete and Diaz together, sometimes in bars, sometimes in front of planes. One showed them standing outside what looked like the Ramsey hardware store. Another, Linda Ramsey, standing between the two men, eyes tense, jaw tight. April in the corner, half in frame, staring directly at the camera. That was the moment it all started to settle in. This wasn't about a storm or a wrong turn. It wasn't even about a crash. It was about something that had been building for months, maybe longer. Something April had seen, something Linda had tried to warn us about. But no one believed them. Not in time. The sheriff pinned the photographs to the board behind her desk. The evidence was growing too fast to keep up with, and still the most important questions hadn't been answered. Where were the Ramseys? And if all this had happened to keep them quiet, why hadn't anyone found the bodies? Then just before dawn, the search team called in from the Everglades. They'd gone a mile deeper into the swamp, past the wreck site, toward a patch of land no one had touched since '78. Caught on a cypress branch was a tattered blue windbreaker. The tag inside read, VD, and the sleeve was stained dark with something that looked an awful lot like blood. They laid the windbreaker out on a clean tarp beneath the evidence tent, the sleeves stiff with dried blood, the fabric torn in 2 places. The initials stitched into the collar, VD, were just barely legible, but nobody had any doubt who it belonged to. The Everglades team had found it a mile from the wreck site, caught on a jagged cypress limb near a patch of soft ground. They marked the area and started sweeping inch by inch. Meanwhile, Sheriff Swopey stood off to the side, arms crossed, eyes on the jacket like it might still give up the truth on its own. I stayed quiet, just listening, watching her study the stain on the sleeve. It wasn't just about Victor Diaz anymore. It was about everything we'd missed for 9 years. Inside the station, she started pulling threads that most people had given up on. She had Ramos from Miami dig deeper into Diaz's known aliases, run them through federal databases, cross-check them against pilot logs, insurance policies, anything that might match the timing of the Ramsey's disappearance. Gertz was buried in files mapping every known associate of Pete Carson and Diaz, even the ones who were dead or missing themselves. I helped where I could, sorting through April's notes again, trying to find anything she might have left behind that could have pointed us forward. She was careful with her words back then, careful in a way most girls our age weren't. When the call came from the hospital the next night, it caught us all off guard. A man named Frank Delgado had been found badly beaten outside a truck stop near the Miami-Dade line. Paramedics said he'd been drifting in and out of consciousness, barely responsive, but at one point he said something about a girl said she never left, and that she left something behind. Swopey didn't wait. She sent a unit to the hospital and had Delgado's name run through state records. Turns out he used to fly cargo runs with Pete back in the late 70s. Nothing on his record but plenty of smoke around his name. By the next morning, Swopey had doubled the search grid in the Everglades. She had volunteers, state troopers, even game wardens combing through waist-deep water and Spanish moss. For the first few hours, it was just more of the same mud insects, busted branches, but sometime after 2, Deputy Gertz called in from a spot near the southern edge of the grid. He'd been clearing a base of a hollow cypress tree when his trowel hit something metal. It was a rusted tin wrapped in plastic and buried beneath about a foot of packed earth and roots. Inside were 4 Polaroids, a sealed envelope, and a small silver locket. I'll never forget the way Swopey looked holding those photos. The first one showed April, her eyes red and swollen, holding a piece of paper that said, "Help us," in shaky handwriting. The second was worse. John and Linda Ramsey tied back to back inside what looked like a wooden structure. Their faces were gaunt, defeated. The third showed Pete Carson and Diaz standing near the plane with a bundle of cash between them. The fourth had a window in the background, just clear enough to recognize a section of rusted piping and broken brick. Swopey stared at it for a long time, then made a quiet call to her deputy. It matched the old Dorsey sugar mill abandoned since the late 60s, sitting right at the edge of the marshland. The envelope held a letter, written in pencil. The handwriting matched April's exactly. "If you find this, it means someone cared enough to keep looking. Carson lied to us. Mom and Dad tried to protect Bobby and me, but Diaz threatened all of us. They made Dad sign something. He cried all night. Carson brought food, but not enough. I think Bobby is sick. I love you. Please don't forget us." Inside the locket was a photo of April and Bobby, both smiling in their old school uniforms, faces still full of light. That night, the sheriff called a press conference. Just a brief statement. No open questions. She stood in front of the town hall and told everyone listening that the Ramsey case was no longer just a missing persons investigation. It was now being treated as a kidnapping and a conspiracy. I remember how quiet the square was after she finished. No reporters shouting questions, just the sound of the courthouse doors closing behind her. Later that night, I watched her lay out the photos on the table back at the station. She didn't say much, just stared at them like she was trying to remember something. Then she turned to Linda's parents and handed them the locket. Linda's mother broke down in the corner. Her father whispered something I couldn't hear, then looked Swope dead in the eye. "You keep digging," he said. "Don't let anyone stop you. Not after all this time." By sunrise, they'd organized a team to sweep the sugar mill. It was slow going. The structure was dangerous, half-collapsed walls, broken glass, rotted floorboards, but the signs were all there. In one back room, they found a tattered baseball cap embroidered with Bobby's name. In another, old food cans and children's handwriting on the plaster. April was here, scratched faintly in the wood near a broken cabinet. Near the rear wall, Deputy Barnes called out that she'd found something. Muddy boot prints fresh. Not from any of our team. Someone had been back here within the last week. It didn't make sense. If the Ramseys had been held here and we had photos that showed it, then why was no one else talking? Why had it taken 9 years to find this place? And if whoever left those prints had been back recently, what were they looking for? Evidence. A trail to cover. As the storm rolled in that afternoon, Sheriff Swope stood in the parking lot of the sugar mill, phone pressed to her ear, waiting for a callback from Miami. We were still sorting through every name linked to Diaz and Carson, looking for any associate who might have stayed close. That's when a fisherman down near the old levee said he saw a man 2 nights ago, tall gray beard, hauling camping gear through the brush near the canal. Said he recognized him from years back, used to work flights with Pete. His name was Roy Carson, Pete's younger brother. And it meant one thing. Someone connected to all of this hadn't run. He'd stayed, and he was still out there, watching, waiting, and maybe trying to finish what was started. The next morning, the rain had let up, but the air still felt heavy. Sheriff Swope stood by the window in her office, staring out across the parking lot as dew steamed off the blacktop. She hadn't said much since the search team confirmed Roy Carson might still be out there. It was the kind of lead you wait years to get solid specific, but it also meant someone who knew what happened had never left. That changes how you look at everything. Gertz brought in the fresh boot prints from the sugar mill for casting, and forensics had started working on comparisons. We knew they were recent days old, maybe less, but matching them to Roy wouldn't be easy. His prints weren't in any open system. He'd kept his name clean even if the people he ran with hadn't. Still, there were other ways to close a circle. Jenny showed up mid-morning with something she'd kept since we were kids. A shoebox full of April's notes. Little scraps of paper she used to pass during math class. Diary entries, copied and folded things she never gave to anyone else. Jenny handed them to the sheriff without a word. We spread them out across the table. Most were what you'd expect doodles, complaints about homework, questions about a boy, but a few had names. One had a quick sketch of the sugar mill labeled our hiding place. Another, dated just a few weeks before the flight, said, "If something goes wrong, look for the room near the old smokestack. It's safe." We didn't know what that meant at first, not until Jenny told us April once mentioned a secret space at the mill, a kind of hideout she and Bobby used when things got tense at home. She'd called it the safe room. It took a crew with pry bars and respirators to break through the bricked-up alcove at the base of the stack. Dust spilled out in waves thick with rot and mildew. The space inside was barely wide enough for 2 people to crouch down side by side. But there were signs someone had used it. Graffiti in childish handwriting. A+B forever. A broken lantern. And in the corner, a metal strongbox with rusted hinges and a small key looped on a chain nailed to the wall. Swope crouched down and opened it slowly, holding her breath. Inside were 2 spiral notebooks, both water-damaged but still readable. One was labeled April, the other Bobby. April's handwriting hadn't changed much from middle school, tight and neat with curled tails and wide margins. The first page said, "If anyone finds this, please help us. We're so scared." Each entry that followed described their time in the mill, who came and went, what they overheard, what they ate, where they hid. April kept a record like she knew someone would need it one day. She listed names, described voices, Wrote about Linda hiding food in the floorboards and John arguing with a man in a sheriff's uniform. But it was the last few pages that chilled us the most. There, folded in the back of Bobby's notebook, was a hand-drawn map of the swamp. Detailed, labeled. 2 red X's marked different spots along the perimeter. One near a stand of old cypress trees, the other deeper in. Below it, a single line. He buried the truth here. Swapee didn't hesitate. She radioed the Everglades team and told them to prep for a deep sweep. She wanted medics standing by drone support if possible, and no press. This wasn't a recovery mission anymore. It was a search for whoever else had stayed behind. Within an hour, the crew was moving through thick brush, the sun burning through the canopy, the map guiding each step. At the first X, they came to a small clearing almost invisible from the air, half flooded, covered in vines. Beneath a sheet of corrugated metal, they found shallow ground. The dirt had been disturbed and packed again. Gently, slowly, they began to dig. What they uncovered were human remains, adult. Not fresh, not skeletal either. There were fragments of clothing still clinging to the bone. A blue windbreaker, or what was left of it. Dental records confirmed it later that night. It was Victor Diaz. Everyone had assumed he'd run, that he'd vanished into the Keys or south into the islands. Turns out he'd never made it out of the swamp. Word spread through the station in hushed voices. It shifted everything. If Diaz was dead, if he'd been buried here since '78, then someone else had been keeping the threats going. Someone had kept the money moving. Someone had returned to the sugar mill maybe more than once to make sure the truth stayed buried. Before we could process that, another radio call came in from the search team. Movement had been spotted near the second X. A figure in the trees, broad-shouldered, moving slow but not like he was lost, like he knew exactly where he was going. Swopey and Gertz grabbed their gear and went out with the team, wading knee-deep through marsh water and roots. The sun had started to dip by the time they found him, standing just beyond a curtain of moss, hands raised, shirt-soaked beard thick with sweat. Roy Carson didn't fight. He looked at the sheriff like he'd been expecting her. "You're too late," he said. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." When they cuffed him, he didn't resist, just muttered that he'd tried to help, that he'd tried to do right after Pete and Diaz started pulling the family apart. But then, he said something else, something none of us were prepared for. He said there was someone else, not Diaz, not Pete, someone local, a man in uniform. And then he reached into his coat, slow and deliberate, and pulled out a weather-worn photograph. Pete Carson, shaking hands with Sheriff Lester Mlan. And everything went still. The photo was curled at the edges, water-warped and sun-bleached, but the 2 faces in it were clear as day. Pete Carson younger, then tan, sharp-eyed, a cigarette between his fingers, and standing next to him with one hand on his belt and the other gripping Pete's like a deal had just been made was Sheriff Lester Mlan. It took a second for the room to register what we were looking at. Roy didn't say another word. He just let the picture hang in the air like he knew it would land harder than anything else he could have told us. Swopee didn't speak either. She took the photo, studied it in silence, then nodded once at Gertz. "Get him to holding," she said. "I want every file Milan ever signed for pulled and spread out on my desk." The rest of that night we barely moved from the table. Every scrap from 1978 was re-examined: interview transcripts, radio logs, call sheets, even coffee-stained margin notes no one had touched in decades. Things we'd overlooked started making more sense. Whole sections of the original search grid had been left out of official records. The dive logs stopped just short of the area where the wreck was eventually found. The wreckage inventory had no record of a duffel bag or cooler, though both were there when the plane was uncovered. And one page, handwritten in a different style, said simply, "All leads exhausted. Close file. No further action." At the bottom, a note scribbled diagonally in pencil. Call Pete if anything changes. Use back channel. We didn't sleep. Swoupy called Ramos in Miami and laid it all out. The photo, the old entries, the chain of silence that went higher than we'd imagined. Ramos agreed to cross-check Milan's name against the original insurance fraud cases. Said he remembered whispers about local law enforcement being involved, but no one ever got close enough to pin it down. It was always someone just outside the line of fire, someone who knew how to stay useful. By noon the next day, we had a deputy posted at Milan's old hunting cabin west of town. No phone line, no internet, just a propane tank and a chain lock on the door. When the deputy called in, his voice was tight. "There's movement inside. Looks like he's packing." Swoupy and Gertz didn't wait for backup. They drove out themselves, pulled off the road a quarter-mile out, and approached through the brush. The lights were on inside. A shadow moved behind the curtains, slow, deliberate. Swoupy stepped onto the porch and knocked hard, one hand on her sidearm. "Lester," she called. "It's Sheriff Swoupy. Open the door." There was a pause longer than it should have been. Then the knob turned. He looked older than I remembered. Softer around the jaw, deeper creases under the eyes. But the posture was still there. That quiet stiffness, like he was still giving orders even when he wasn't talking. "You're making a mistake," he said. "Am I?" Swoupy stepped forward. "We found Diaz. We found April's letters." Roy gave us the photo. Her voice was steady but low. "You lied to this town for 9 years. Milan didn't flinch. I did what I had to do. You helped stage a disappearance," she said. "You turned that family into ghosts." He looked down, jaw-tight eyes unmoving. "Pete and Diaz were out of control. John owed money. Things got out of hand. I tried to contain it." She shook her head. "You covered it up. You let them disappear." He didn't answer. Not with words. Just stepped back slow like he was about to surrender. But the second she dropped her guard, there was a crack from the back of the house. A door slamming. Gertz's voice cutting through the trees. "He's got a runner!" Milan bolted for the rug in the center of the room. Flipped it back, yanked a metal case from the floorboards, and was out the rear door in seconds. Swoupy followed. Brush tore at her sleeves. The light was fading fast. She caught up just as he tripped over a root, the box tumbling from his hands. She was on him before he could reach it again, cuffed him in the mud, breath heaving between them. "It's over, Lester," she said, and this time he didn't argue. The metal box held what we'd been missing. Letters, photos, and a cassette tape labeled in scratchy pen Ramsey, "Evidence. For my eyes only." Back at the station, Swoupy sat in the interrogation room across from Milan. The tape deck sat between them. She pressed play. Pete Carson's voice crackled through the speaker, nervous, dry-throated. "Lester, if you're hearing this, I'm dead or gone. Diaz is losing it. John can't pay. Linda's talking about the police. I tried to keep the kids out of it, but it's falling apart. If they find the money, we're all done. If you care about this town, make sure it never comes out." Swoupy didn't blink. "How long were you involved?" Milan stared at the table. John was in over his head. Pete said he could buy him time. Then Diaz showed up, threatened Linda, said he'd take the kids if they didn't cooperate. I thought if I could redirect the search by some time, maybe they'd let the family go. "Where are they?" she asked. His voice cracked then. First time I'd ever heard it waver. "I don't know. After the crash, Pete and Diaz took them to the mill, said they needed leverage. But Linda tried to run. Diaz shot John. I found the body a week later. Pete said he let the kids go, but I never saw them again." She slid the Polaroids across the table. April's "Help Us" photo, the image of Linda tied up. "You didn't know about these." He looked at them for a long time. Pete said he burned everything. Said if I crossed him, he'd send it all to the press. Gertz stepped in with an update. Forensics had matched the blood on the windbreaker to Diaz and to John Ramsey. The baseball cap from the mill had Bobby's DNA on it. The evidence was tightening like a noose. Still one question hung in the air. Are the kids dead? Milan shook his head, eyes damp. I don't know. I swear I don't. I searched that mill top to bottom. They were gone. I thought maybe they got lost. Maybe someone helped them. But I didn't have the guts to say any of it. Word of Milan's arrest spread through town fast. People didn't know how to respond. Some refused to believe it. Others nodded quietly like the puzzle pieces finally fit. At the station, I sat with April's old notebooks running every name she'd ever written through local directories trying to connect the dots. Most were dead ends, but one name kept repeating, written 3 times in different ink, all beneath the same phrase. She brought bread when Pete was away. It wasn't anyone tied to the case formally. No deputy, no suspect. It was Lucille Hodges, a retired church volunteer who lived 3 miles from the sugar mill and who'd never left town. When we knocked on her door the next morning, she didn't seem surprised. She opened it slow, invited us in. The house smelled like damp paper and black tea. I always wondered when someone would ask, she said. And then she sat down and told us what really happened the night the Ramsey children disappeared. Lucille Hodges kept her hands folded in her lap eyes on the kitchen window where the wind was moving the pine trees just outside. She didn't speak right away. Just listened as the house ticked with age, as if she were waiting for some long-forgotten permission to speak. Then she nodded once slowly and said, I remember the girl's face first. April. She had that look like she'd seen too much too soon. Her voice didn't waver, but it was quiet, like she knew that once she started, she wouldn't be able to take any of it back. She said the first time she saw April and Bobby, it was the fall of 1978. Maybe late October. The kids came to her back door after dark, barefoot clothes damp and torn, asking for food. They didn't say where they came from. Just said, we're not safe where we were. Lucille was in her 60s then, a retired Sunday school teacher who kept mostly to herself. She said she'd seen them before at the market at Sunday services, and something in her knew they weren't lying. She brought them in, fed them, gave them blankets, told them they could stay for a night or 2. That night stretched into a week, then 2. April kept watch from the bedroom window every night, afraid someone would come looking. Bobby barely spoke, just held tight to a worn-out Red Sox cap and chewed at his fingers. After 2 weeks, Lucille said she tried to call the sheriff's office just to report what she thought might be 2 runaways. But when she asked for Sheriff Milan, the line went silent. Then someone else came on and said, wrong number. She never called again. But the kids wouldn't leave, not even when she told them they could. April said there were men who'd find them, that they were safer staying hidden. Lucille made them a room in the attic, kept it warm, stocked it with snacks and books. She taught April how to bake, let Bobby fix things around the house. They called her Miss Lucy, and for a time she said it almost felt like a family. But then one morning she found April shaking in the hallway, a note clenched in her hand. Someone had left it under the front door. 4 words, all uppercase block letters, they know. Get out. Lucille burned it in the sink before the kids could see it. But from then on, the fear came back hard. The next day, a truck idled outside for almost 20 minutes. Just sitting there. Driver never got out. Lucille said April stayed behind the curtains the whole time, whispering, that's his truck. That's his. They never said who he was. But the next morning, the kids were gone. They'd taken only what they could carry, a blanket, some clothes, and Bobby's notebook. Lucille said she searched the woods for days, left out food. Never saw them again. We sat in silence a long time after she finished. Swope thanked her, gently. Promised she'd be protected if anything else came out. Then Lucille reached for a tin box on the shelf above the stove. Inside were photos, grainy Polaroids, some fading all real, April and Bobby smiling, baking cookies, fixing a chair, and one of them standing in the attic eyes wide holding a flashlight. Behind them, barely visible in the shadow, was a figure. A man. Face turned away. We scanned it into the system that night, ran it against what little we had. The body build, hairline, posture, it wasn't Diaz. Wasn't Pete. And it sure as hell wasn't Milan. It was someone we hadn't seen before. Swope called Roy back into interrogation. This time she didn't ask open-ended questions. She laid the photo on the table and pointed. "Who is this?" Roy didn't answer at first, just stared at it like it physically hurt to look. Then he leaned forward and whispered, "That's your answer." "Who?" she pressed. He exhaled slow. "That's the one Pete called the cleaner. Said he was insurance, someone who wasn't supposed to exist on paper, local muscle, knew how to move bodies and not leave questions." Name Roy shook his head. He didn't go by one, just a nickname. They called him Smoke. That stopped everything. Not because of the name, but because Ramos, the Miami investigator, had mentioned it once before. Back in the original files, there'd been a line redacted from one of the transcripts. A survivor from a fraud ring in Broward had said, "They're gonna send Smoke." The rest had been blacked out. We didn't know who he was, but we knew where to start. Lucille said the attic had a loose board, one the kids used to hide notes, drawings, little things they wanted to keep secret. She'd never pried it up. Said it felt wrong. That night we climbed the ladder, dust thick in the air. Mice scurried in the corners. We found the board, pulled it slow. Inside were 3 items. A faded bus ticket dated November 11th, 1978, destination Fort Myers, a folded receipt from a gas station just outside town, and a photograph of April, handwritten on the back in Bobby's print. She made it. Tell them that. But no mention of Bobby himself, no second ticket, and that silence told us more than anything else could have. Whatever happened after that, he didn't leave with her. And someone, maybe this Smoke, made sure of it. The confession didn't come all at once. Roy didn't crack under pressure. He unraveled slow, like a man peeling back bandages he'd kept tight for too many years. Sheriff Swope sat across from him in the interview room, tape-rolling pen still in hand. He didn't ask for a lawyer, just said he was tired of carrying ghosts. Said if Bobby was still out there somewhere dead or alive, he deserved the truth. It started with Pete Carson. Pete had worked for Milan's campaign years before all this, doing favors, calling in debts. When the smuggling operation through Glade County kicked off in earnest, Pete ran transport. Diaz did cleanup. But there were gaps, Roy said, dead ends that needed someone colder than either of them. That's when Smoke showed up. Nobody used his real name, not even Milan. He was ex-military, maybe ex-sheriff from another county. Paid in cash, no paper trail. He did the things the others wouldn't. When Pete needed someone watched, followed, or disappeared, Smoke handled it. The night April and Bobby fled the sugar mill, it wasn't Pete who followed. It was Smoke. Roy didn't know where the kids ran to, only that they didn't make it far. Milan gave the order, find them, but keep it quiet. Make sure no bodies turned up. Make it look like they vanished on their own. Roy said that last part always stuck with him. Milan didn't want blood. He wanted silence. And he knew Lucille's house was off limits. Too visible. Too close to town. So they waited. Roy drove loops around the county. Checked bus depots, church basements, soup kitchens. When nothing turned up, Pete said, "It's done. Let it go." But then 2 weeks later, Smoke called in. Said he'd found the boy. Just the boy. Alive. Hiding out in an abandoned canning facility 10 miles west of the swamp line. Said the girl had gotten on a bus gone. But Bobby had doubled back. Thought he was being brave. Roy went to the site. Said he saw the truck. Saw Bobby's backpack. But never saw the kid. Smoke told him, "It's handled," and that was the end of it. No body, no paperwork. Nothing for Roy to question except the silence. Swope asked him if he believed Bobby had been killed. Roy didn't answer right away, just looked down at the table and said, "Let's just say I never saw him again." And smoke never missed. We tracked down the canning facility the next morning. Overgrown, swallowed by vines. Tin roof collapsed in places. Inside, most of the floor was buckled, but a few interior walls still stood. Along the far edge was a trapdoor padlocked. Gertz found bolt cutters in the truck. We pried it open and climbed down, slow, careful. The air shifted immediately. Stale, damp. Smelled like rust and wet paper. The basement was small, barely a cellar, but in the corner was a shallow grave half-caved, and beside it a rusted toolbox. Inside was a single sneaker, child-sized, red canvas, torn at the heel, no bones, no body, not yet, but enough to call in the forensic unit. While they worked, Swope contacted FDLE, asked for any files tied to the name Smoke and anyone employed in Glade County law enforcement between 75 and 85 who disappeared off the books. Took 2 days to get the response. 3 names were flagged. One matched a composite sketch drawn from Lucille's attic photo. His name was Anthony Shore. Served 2 years as a deputy in neighboring Okeechobee County before resigning under unspecified health reasons. Vanished in '79. And here's where it got strange. In 1981, a private investigator named Colby Marsh filed a missing persons report for his sister, a woman named Sarah who'd been dating Shore before he disappeared. That report had been sealed. Buried so deep it took 2 federal warrants to open it. And when it finally came through, the connection was clear. Shore hadn't just disappeared. He'd changed his name. Started over. Under a new alias, he'd been working security at a private hunting lodge 20 miles west of the Everglades. Same lodge Pete Carson used to host fundraising retreats back in the day. We sent a team out before sunrise. Unmarked cars. Quiet approach. Shore wasn't there, but the cabin he'd used had been cleared out recently. Inside, we found maps, burner phones, and something we hadn't expected, a full list of the original Everglades field trip students from 1978. Names, birth dates, medical records. Some were crossed out in red, others circled. April's name was underlined twice. Bobby's was marked. No one knew what it meant. But it made one thing clear: someone had kept tabs long after the world moved on. And then came the real break. Forensics from the sugar mill finally came back. Blood, dried deep in the concrete under the safe room, matched to Bobby Hale's. The notebook, the map, the sneaker, the grave, all of it pointed to one truth. Bobby never left, and someone made damn sure of it. As the sun went down that evening, Swope stood at the edge of the old canning facility, boots sunk in the mud, flashlight fading. She didn't speak for a long time. Then she said, "It's not over." And she turned toward the trees. There's still one more name that doesn't belong. Sometimes the hardest part isn't what you find, it's what you don't. We never recovered Bobby's remains. The site near the canning facility yielded fragments soil disturbed in a way that told a story but no body, no confirmation. Just enough to understand that someone had been buried and that someone had been dug back up. Forensics later confirmed the sneaker was his. The blood in the sugar mill, too. That part of the story had weight now, but not form, not closure. And maybe that's what Sheriff Swope meant when she said it wasn't over. Anthony Shore, if that's who he truly was, never resurfaced. FDLE tracked one last signal ping from a burner phone bouncing off a tower near the Alabama state line. After that silence. The lodge was emptied, wiped clean, even the drains scoured. Someone had planned their exit long before we got close. Pete Carson died 2 weeks after the warrant was issued. Massive stroke. No statement, no confession. Just another locked door we'll never open. April's name never appeared in any of the files we recovered. Not once. No medical notes, no photos, no alias. It's as if she slipped the net completely. Sheriff Swope thinks that part might be true, that she really did get away, that she lived under another name, maybe still does. I've gone through every state registry I can get my hands on, scanned shelters, safe houses, closed, case reports. Nothing. But I still check. Once a week. Every week. Lucille passed last fall. Quietly in her sleep. Her niece mailed us a box she'd kept tucked under the bed. Photos, notes, newspaper clippings. April's drawing of the sugar mill was in there. The one with the big eyes in the window, and the crayon-scribbled sky. On the back, written in pencil so faint you had to hold it to the light, were the words, "He knows the woods better than us." We still don't know what she meant. But I think about that sentence more than I probably should. The official record now lists Bobby Hales as presumed deceased. His mother, Denise, held a small service this past spring. Just a few of us there. No casket, no photos. Just his name on a wooden plaque set beneath the big pine behind her house, the one he used to climb when he was little. She told me afterward she didn't expect answers anymore. Just peace. I hope she finds some. I think the hardest part of these cases isn't the darkness. It's the fact that light doesn't behave the way you want it to. It doesn't shine evenly. It leaves pockets, shadows that stretch across years, lives, towns. Sometimes you don't get the whole truth, just pieces. A name here, a blood match there, a basement with no body. But even fragments can weigh something. And when you gather enough of them, you start to understand what was buried and who did the burying. Sheriff Swope retired not long after we closed the file. Moved up to Georgia, I heard. Said she wanted to be closer to her grandkids. But I know she keeps a box in her attic labeled 1978. I know because she told me. Said some stories don't leave you no matter how far you drive. Me, I still live here, still wear the badge. But I've started locking my doors again. I walk slower near the tree line. And when the wind shifts in summer, I swear I can still smell burnt sugar like something faint and broken being stirred back up through the soil. If this story stayed with you, if you're still here, still listening, consider sharing it. Because what happened to April and Bobby shouldn't be forgotten. Some names deserve to be spoken out loud, even if the world tried to bury them.